heard at all.
So, Senator, I've talked to you about this. I've talked to Senator Hassan about this and others. One thing I asked my team to do last week was to convene a meeting of I have a trade advisory council for small business. I've asked them to convene that meeting. I've connected with the Small Business Administration. They have an international trade desk there. I've talked to I have an office that also deals with small business because I do want to hear it. I think it's important that we hear it because they don't have the same voices in Washington. I will say right now, Canada and Mexico, things coming from Canada and Mexico that comply with the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement come in duty-free. They continue to do so if they follow the rules. If they don't follow the rules and are trying to put in Chinese stuff, that's going to be tariffed. But if they follow the rules, they're going to be getting the duty-free treatment they're due.
Well, a small business that has gone broke is not very amenable to a meeting. They don't exist any longer.
Senator Hassan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. Good morning, Ambassador Greer. Thank you for being here. Before I start with a couple of additional questions about the impact of these tariffs, I want to associate myself with Senator Whitehouse's comments just now about the impact on our small businesses, particularly those who are critical parts of supply chains for some of our larger corporations in the country. As you know, Canada is our biggest trading partner too, and we are already seeing the impact of these tariffs with our small businesses, especially in our tourism industry, which is being decimated because Canadians are not coming down to New Hampshire the way they usually do. Let me ask you about a couple of other things. President Trump's tariffs have made almost everything that families buy more expensive. The president imposed a 10% national sales tax on all imports into our country and an even higher sales tax on imports from more than 50 countries, including our allies like Canada. This is the largest tax increase in over half a century, and it's going to cost the average American family $3,800 a year. Their morning cup of coffee will cost more, so will new shoes for their kids, and so will fresh fruit. So my question to you, Ambassador, is how much revenue from the president's national sales tax will be used to give tax breaks to billionaires?
So, Senator, as you know, any kind of tariff revenue that comes in to the United States government, it goes to the Treasury, and Congress will decide what happens to that money. Obviously, the president wants to have a very competitive tax policy that's good for everybody. That was part of why he had such a successful economy in the first term, is he married trade action with good tax policy to have $7,000 an increase in real wages over that time.
Well, let's be really clear. The president, besides the contradictions in the way he talks about the purpose of his tariffs, the president's made very clear that he sees tariffs as a way of increasing revenue. At the same time, he's working with the majority in Congress to give additional tax breaks to the wealthiest people in the country at the expense of working people who are going to be paying more for everyday goods they absolutely have to pay, goods they were hoping were going to cost less given the president's campaign promises. But of course, he isn't keeping to those campaign promises as prices continue to go up. Now, the president's national sales tax is increasing prices for families. It's also causing huge losses in Americans' retirement savings. Ambassador Greer, would the administration reverse course if the president's tariffs led to 10% inflation?
Senator, the president is fixed in his purpose. This trade deficit and the offshoring and loss of manufacturing jobs is something that's persisted for too long, and it's dangerous.
I understand your justification for the policy, even though there are some very contradictory justifications coming out of the administration. But my question is, what's the inflation rate where you guys would reverse course? 10% inflation that I just asked you about, that is higher inflation than we saw at the peak of the COVID economic crisis. But you aren't going to say here today that you would reverse course even if you created inflation as high as we had at the peak of the COVID economic crisis.
I think the most serious inflation we saw was during the Biden administration. When we did tariffs in the first term, inflation went down. I just don't. It's not going to be a one-to-one. Inflation about how much money you're putting into the supply.
Well, let's just be really clear that the Trump administration is here today to say that even if inflation hits Americans' pocketbooks at 10% because of these tariffs, then the Trump administration is still going to go charging ahead. So, Ambassador, would the administration reverse course if the president's tariffs caused a 50% stock market crash, which would hurt Americans' retirement savings even more than they've been hurt in the last 10 days or so?
Senator, the fundamentals of the economy are so strong. We had 228,000 jobs last month. We have 9,000 additional manufacturing jobs from
So
from the
again,
month before.
your answer is even if the stock market crashes 50%, which is how much the stock market crashed in the Great Recession, you're not going to say here today that you would reverse course even if you crash the stock market and harm retirement savings as drastically as happened during the Great Recession in 2007.
Senator, your hypotheticals are not consistent with the history we have seen with the use of tariffs.
My hypotheticals are based on the fact that a lot of Americans are looking at their 401ks today and wondering how much of a lifestyle change they are going to have, or whether they're going to be able to retire when they plan to, because of the recklessness and haphazard nature of the Trump administration's imposition of tariffs. Nothing was thought out about this. This has been a haphazard, incompetent effort, and it's showing. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy.
Hey, Mr. Greer, thank you for being here. When I speak to my rice people and my shrimp people back home, they say that the tariff barriers and the subsidies by other countries for those products are so much that it is putting some of our shrimpers and some of our rice people either out of business or in incredible financial binds. And so the fact that the president is attempting to address these as well as the non-tariff trade barriers is incredibly important. Let me first say that. But I also hear from my producers that the mean tariff being selected to apply to a country may not account that for rice, for example, the tariff is much higher for that particular product, and that it is not adequate to address that which is taking place. Any thoughts on that, and how can we have something more particular for products which are really over tariffed?
Yes, thank you, and I appreciate that concern, and the tariff rate applied to many of these countries, again, was a countrywide rate. It wasn't product specific. My sense is if countries come to us and they expect to have some kind of a different plan, they will need to change these things, right? And they will have specific products, specific barriers that they would have to address, right? Or else, the president, again, he's fixed his purpose. He wants to see production back here. He wants to see our agriculture producers doing well. And these countries just have to have reciprocal trade with us. And that means taking care of the types of barriers and tariff rates you're talking about.
So it sounds like you, one of the things I think they want to know is that since shrimp might be a relatively small part of trades with some of these countries, that the interests of, for example, shrimp will not be sacrificed in part of a greater whole.
No, I think, and I saw a really interesting article today in the New York Times on shrimp. You may have seen that, where the tariffs have actually given a bit of a lifeline to these shrimpers. And I think that if there's going to be any kind of change to any of this, and I'm not going to prejudge that, we have to make sure that our industries are protected adequately, so we don't go backwards with the deficit.
Let me ask, in the President's America First trading policy, there's several sections relating to free trade agreements and how they will be evaluated. Senator Bennett and I are working on an America's Act, which would be a hemispheric trade policy, which would have several purposes. One, to strengthen those ties. Secondly, to keep the Chinese from making the incursions that they are absolutely making throughout the hemisphere. Some are calling the Caribbean a Chinese lake. And so this would allow us to push back upon that. Can you share anything regarding the analyses of the free trade agreements we have within our hemisphere, and then specifically on countries like Argentina who would like an FTA with our country?
Certainly. I would say that we are first and foremost focused on addressing this emergency and the reciprocal tariff action and implementing it appropriately. With respect to relations in the hemisphere, any kind of trade arrangements with these trading partners, I think, need to be coupled with strong rules about third countries. What I don't want is a situation where these countries are using, their export platforms to incorporate content and goods from, China or other Asian countries, where we have a real issue with our deficit and offshoring of manufacturing. I would expect any kind of changes to these arrangements to be accompanied by changes in rules of origin to ensure that the United States and U.S. workers are really benefiting from these agreements.
So nothing from an FTA in general, but the specific of where it's being used to circumvent the intent of the FTA is the concern of the administration.
Yes, that's certainly a huge concern. And again, the president wants to see factories back here. The most certain way to not have a tariff is to build your factory in the United States. If people want to use other countries and insist on that, then we want to make sure that they're not using that to arbitrage for higher tariff jurisdictions to use them as an unfair export platform.
Let me ask you this. Louisiana has some of the largest ports in the nation by tonnage. And all the commodities going from the Midwest flow through my state going out to the world. Earlier, USTR proposed imposing like $1 million for every vessel built in China. And I'm told that if the Koreans have a fleet of 50 and 5 of the ships are built in China, then the $1 million would apply to all 50, not just to the ships that are built in China. Now, that would clearly impact a ship coming to the United States to offload. If you will, impact my ports and the ability of our goods throughout the nation to move through the Mississippi. Is USTR going to hang by that or considering modifying that? Can you kind of give us any idea about that?
So to address the lack of shipbuilding in the United States, USTR's proposed actions are just those. They're proposed actions. They're a series of potential remedies that could be used to incentivize shipbuilding in the U.S. They're not all going to be implemented. They're not all going to be stacked. We've asked for a lot of input, and we've had a hearing on that. We've collected comments. We've reviewed it. I've met personally with certain stakeholders during that time period, and I think the president will look very carefully to make sure that we have the right amount of time and the right incentives to create shipbuilding here without impacting our commodity exports.
Okay, thank you. I yield.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, as USTR's Chief of Staff in the first Trump administration, you oversaw the negotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, and the renegotiation of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the KORUS. President Trump signed both of these agreements. He called the USMCA a colossal victory, and KORUS a historic milestone. And yet, with President Trump's new blanket tariffs, he is ripping up these agreements with our allies that we negotiated with. Why would any country want to do business with us, much less negotiate a trade deal, if we don't even honor our ongoing agreements?
So, Senator, we are the consumer of last resort. These countries have to sell here. They have, many of them, especially in Asia, have built their entire economies around exporting to us. They're very dependent on it, and that's part of why we have this huge trade deficit. With USMCA, those parties continue to enjoy duty-free treatment for many of the products that continue to comply with the rules that were set out 5 years ago. There's a big concern, Senator, that we did not have adequate other protections to stop the flow, particularly of like autos into the United States.
But there was a process for you to renegotiate that agreement this year. We talked about that in my office. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And it wasn't to do these blanket tariffs, correct?
What we have to address is an emergency, Senator.
That's true. And you should be honest. At least as you sit here, as you were in my office, be intellectually honest. Now, let me just ask this, because this is also true. And I so appreciate my Senator Langford asking this. Time matters. How long did it take to negotiate that agreement, the USMCA, that you were part of?
We did it at breakneck speed. We did it in about 2 years.
2 years. And now you're telling us you have nearly 50 countries coming to you, approaching you to enter in a negotiation. And you think that you can do that overnight?
India.
Man, you're pretty superhuman here, if that's the case. So let's be realistic. That's all we're asking. Common sense and realism here, Ambassador, as you sit here before us. And let me talk about something else that is really important for my state, and I think this entire country, because this administration is forgetting that we have $1 billion economy when it comes to tourism into the United States. People know Las Vegas. My state is Nevada. We rely on tourism to our state, and now we're seeing an impact because of these tariffs, not just from Canada, but I am hearing from so many that are in the tourism and kind of leisure industry. We are seeing impacts because now this billion-dollar industry of international tourism is having an impact on our economy. And this is a service industry. Let me just say this. I'm kind of offended by your testimony today that says we must accept self-inflicted economic pain, and I quote you by saying, to become an economy based on producing real goods and services. What does that mean? What does that mean to my service industry and every service industry across this country that relies on tourism and travel? That is the backbone, really, of part of our billion-dollar economy. What do I tell them? That they just have to suck it up? That they're not really part of this real services? That you have another idea for the jobs that they should engage in? What do I tell them?
Oh, Senator, of course those are real services. The whole,
So what are you doing about the impact
whole,
what are you doing about the impact of international tourism and now these blanket tariffs having a negative impact? What are you doing to address that?
the whole sentence, Senator, said that we need to get away from government spending as funding our economy and financialization, and we need to move to real goods and services, including the tourism you're talking about.
So
It's
what are you doing
incredibly
to impact the
important.
negative impact of tourism right now?
Well, one thing I'll say is we can't have the status quo, right? I keep hearing that we should have, essentially what I'm hearing is we should have the status quo. We should keep the $1.2 trillion trade deficit that Biden left us with.
I'm asking you,
and I don't think that's adequate.
what are you doing in this administration to address now the impact that you're having with these blanket tariffs, not targeted tariffs, blanket tariffs, on international tourism that is a big impact to our economy? What are you doing to address that?
Well, Senator, as we're talking to all of these countries, we are talking about services. We are talking about making sure that we can export services to other countries. A lot of those that we export are, we have
Well,
digital
let me say I
services.
only have so
all
much
kinds
time,
of
and
trade.
apparently you're not. So here's what I would like, because you haven't thought about this, and the administration hasn't really thought about it, because I haven't heard anybody talking about tourism. So why don't you come talk to me in my office, and let's talk about and put a plan together, because these blanket tariffs are having an impact on tourism in my state and across the country.
Senator, I'm happy to
instead
come
of
talk
just
to you.
defending it, why don't you just come sit down with some of us and try to address the concerns that we are seeing and feeling in our states that this administration has not taken into account?
I'm happy to come speak with you. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Grassley.
Ambassador Greer, thank you for being here. I've made very clear throughout my public service that I'm a free and fair trader. The Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. I believe that Congress delegated too much authority to the President in Trade Expansion Acts of 1962 and Trade Act of 1974. That said, I support President Trump's agenda to lower tariffs and non-tariff barriers other countries impose on American goods. I support President Trump's agenda to get a better deal from China and other countries for our farmers and manufacturers. In fact, even back in 2003, I sent a letter to the Chinese Minister of Commerce at that time pointing out China's failure to live up to its WTO obligations. And then I went further in 2018 when I was on Senator Daines' Codell. I told top Chinese leaders I made a mistake supporting China in the WTO. That's why during the first Trump administration, I was supportive of President's agenda to get fair trade with China. At the time, I raised alarm bells when tariffs are used. We all know agriculture is usually the first place of retaliation. In response to Chinese retaliation to tariffs, the first Trump administration set up the Market Facilitation Program for farmers, which gave direct payments to farmers affected by the tariffs. This helped farmers weather the short-term impact of trade retaliation. But as you know, farmers still overwhelmingly want to get their money from the marketplace and not from a government check. So far in this administration, we've seen even more sweeping tariffs, with some countries already retaliating agriculture, including China. I have been very vocal in my wait and see approach to these tariffs because I believe President Trump and you, Mr. Ambassador, are using them to get fair trade for Americans with many countries. If that's not the case, level with me. So to help farmers in the meantime, instead of relying on payments from the government, I'm going to give a suggestion that you don't have much to do with, but the administration could move very quickly to increase RVOs on the renewable fuel standards so that farmers get more robust domestic markets for their crops. And one place to start would be where the Biden administration came up short with RVOs, only 3 1/10 billion over a 3-year period of time on biodiesel, to make that 5.3 as far as you can see into the future. That would very dramatically increase soybean prices. So my question to you is, in the medium to the long term, do you plan to turn these tariffs into trade deals to reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers? I support that. On the other hand, if the purpose is to stall on negotiations in order to keep tariffs high for the sole purpose of feeding the U.S. Treasury, I oppose that. So is this administration for trade reciprocity or for Treasury replenishment?
Senator, thank you, and thank you for your years of service on the trade space, and you're one of the deans in this area. It's important to understand the sense of the emergency that we're facing and urgency with the need to reshore and do manufacturing here. It's incredibly important to the president. Yesterday, he stated very clearly that he is happy to engage in negotiations immediately with countries that believe that they can help us reduce our deficit and get rid of the non-tariff barriers and the tariffs that affect that. I think the answer, Senator, is it's going to be country by country. There are going to be some countries where they're not able to address their non-tariff barriers or their tariffs or the deficit fully, and there will be others who I think will be able to do that, and where the president will have the option of making a deal with them. So we're certainly seeking reciprocity. Now, if we have the tariff on a country, there's obviously going to be a revenue effect, but we need to reshore manufacturing, we need to get rid of our agricultural deficit, and we need to make sure that if countries are going to trade with us, it has to be on a reciprocal basis.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Greer, good to see you. You and I have had many conversations about trade. I think my question this morning, though, starts with the consultation that Congress deserves on trade issues from the trade ambassador. And what did the Trump administration do to prepare us, to communicate with us, to tell us about findings as it relates to these emergency orders by the president?
Thank you, Senator. As you know, I find consultation requirements very important, and not just as a requirement, just a matter of good practice. Our staff, the USTR staff, in the past 2 months that we've been in office, have had over 200 formal engagements with staff on the Hill, obviously here in the Senate, also in the House. The day of the reciprocal trade announcement, we had our staff also up here briefing your staff. And we also had the president issue very publicly his America First trade policy memorandum, which specifically said that he was going to look into the trade deficit and the possibilities of tariffs.
So we've wreaked havoc on the economy by having one of the largest drops of the market. We have people's 401 in panic. We have retail organizations like the Retail Industry, National Retail Federation, American Apparel Industry, Outdoor Association, Consumer Technology, Computer Communications Industry, Main Street Alliance, Small Business Majority, all anxious, asking us to do something. And you're saying, well, some people passed some notes to staff. What the requirement is, and this is where I believe the president has misconstructed and actually exploited this authority, is not communicated to us, nor these interest groups that are now panicked over the effect of tariffs. So I would say that the skill set of a USTR office or even a Treasury Secretary could have opened these conversations with these countries without the tariffs and saved a lot of people a lot of pain and anguish. I worry that this trust issue, because I have a different worldview, that we should be building alliances as a way to counter China, that the alliance building process now will become harder. And people are going to wonder, well, is the United States going to pull another fast one again and just wreak havoc, when in reality, countering China with a tech NATO or something like that is a more powerful tool. Do you have a comment about that?
I do, and I think we do need to be thoughtful about this. I think what we can't do is wait. We have had many times in past decades when we have had real robust trade disputes with our partners. Japan in the 80s and early 90s over cars, semiconductors, and they ended reshoring a lot of those factories here. And it didn't make us less of a security partner to Japan. I think we can have these conversations like friends do. And that's what the president said yesterday. He said, listen, China's trying to retaliate. They're taking a different path. But for others who want to have meetings,
I want to reclaim
we'll
my time for a second because I only have 5 minutes and you have lots of time to answer lots of questions for members. But you can see all my colleagues, we are thoughtful people with specific issues about our constituencies. I just met with raspberry growers. They're concerned. They want to know if they're going to get some seat on a council so they can have their issues heard. I'm for trade. I represent trade. I represent a trade economy. I represent the success of what innovation and trade get you. But you're coming here this morning with this not only tanking of the market and 401s, now you're coming here telling me that tariff is the tool. And I'm telling you innovation is the tool. You're telling us in your testimony you want a tariff on semiconductors. I'm saying that the last administration and this organization here passed the Chips and Science Act so we could reshore semiconductors here in the United States. So you're not going to win the innovation economy by tariffing semiconductors and reshoring that. I don't know what you think. I'm not trying to get the semiconductor. I want to lead on next generation semiconductor manufacturing because I'm pretty sure I'm sitting next to the Intel ranking member here who's going to tell me if we don't lead on semiconductor manufacturing and semiconductor next generation technology, then we're not going to be leading in defense or in AI or in anything. So I want to innovate my way to that future, and I want to use the alliance power of different countries to force China and other people to follow us instead of this berating of the American consumer who has to pay the price for this policy.
Senator, TSMC has announced a new announcement where they're going to have more investment here in the United States so they can make those things here and have that innovation.
Thank you, the people who voted for the Chips and Science Act in the past administration. Thank you for that. We are going to lead on innovation despite this administration.
Senator Warner.
Well, Ambassador Greer, it's good to see you. And let me, first of all, completely agree with Senator Cantwell. I mean, I just don't get it. The fact on semiconductors, why you gave a small exemption, you didn't exempt GPUs, you didn't exempt lithography equipment, you put a huge hit on Taiwan, where we need collaboration with the TSMC. I'm baffled. I mean, you're gonna hear from me what I'm sure you're hearing from most of us, incredulous about, I think, probably the worst economic policies that I've seen in my lifetime. And the data reflects that. A global tariff of